The unexpected airport encounter. Keanu Reeves had always preferred to travel under the radar. Unlike many celebrities who demanded VIP treatment, he was the kind of person who stood in lines, carried his own luggage, and never made a fuss about anything. He had spent years in the spotlight, but when it came to everyday life, he just wanted to be another person passing through the world quietly. Today was supposed to be no different. His flight was scheduled to depart from Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, to Tokyo, where he was set to begin filming a highly anticipated new movie. It was a long-haul flight, and after weeks of intense training for his role, his assistant had insisted on booking him a first-class ticket so he could rest properly before landing. Keanu, always appreciative but never entitled, had reluctantly agreed. He didn't mind economy. He had spent most of his life flying coach, sitting among regular passengers, and enjoying casual conversations with strangers. But this time, he allowed himself a bit of comfort. Or so he thought. As he approached the first-class check-in counter, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he was met with the usual flurry of airport activity. Passengers rushing to their gates, flight announcements echoing overhead, and the occasional fan whispering as they recognized him. He offered a few polite nods but kept moving. All he wanted was to get on the plane, settle into his seat, and get some much-needed rest. But fate had other plans. The gatekeeper of first class. At the check-in desk stood a sharply dressed airline staff member, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun, her uniform pristine, her expression unreadable. Her name tag read Madeline. She barely glanced at Keanu before holding up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "First-class passengers only," she said coolly. Keanu, unbothered, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. "I am flying first class." Madeline took the ticket from him, her eyes scanning it quickly before her lips twisted into a skeptical smirk. "This must be a mistake." Keanu frowned slightly. "I don't think so. That's my seat." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow upgrades or complimentary tickets into first class today. That section is reserved for our paying elite passengers." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I am a paying passenger." Madeline let out a small, condescending laugh. "Sir, with all due respect, I highly doubt that." Before Keanu could respond, she did something no one expected. She took his ticket between her manicured fingers and ripped it in half. The crisp sound of paper tearing filled the air, causing a few nearby passengers to turn their heads in shock. A stunned silence followed. Keanu stared at the shredded remains of his boarding pass, his face betraying nothing. But inside, he was floored. A scene unfolds. The tension in the air was palpable. The moment the ticket was torn, a murmur of whispers rippled through the terminal. A few passengers nearby, who had recognized Keanu, gasped in disbelief. Who in their right mind would do that? A younger staff member, who had been assisting at the counter, immediately went pale. His eyes darted between Keanu and Madeline, his face a mixture of horror and panic. "Madeline," the young employee whispered urgently, "I think you just made a mistake." But Madeline, still oblivious to the gravity of what she had just done, crossed her arms. "If you want to fly with us, sir, you'll have to purchase a ticket like everyone else," she said, her tone clipped. Keanu let out a quiet chuckle, not one of amusement, one of pure disbelief. He wasn't a man who threw around his fame. He wasn't the type to pull the "do you know who I am" card. But this was insanity. A growing crowd and an approaching storm. By now, more people had gathered. Some were filming, others whispering in hushed voices. The scene had quickly escalated from a private misunderstanding to a full-blown spectacle. A business executive standing nearby shook his head. Did she just tear up Keanu Reeves' ticket? He muttered to his assistant. A woman holding her phone whispered, "Is this really happening?" Even the flight crew had started taking notice. A senior flight attendant who had been assisting in the background quickly hurried over, sensing something had gone very, very wrong. "Excuse me, "What's going on here?" she asked, stepping between Keanu and Madeline. Madeline let out a huff, rolling her eyes. "This gentleman," she emphasized the word sarcastically, "was trying to sneak into first class with some fake ticket. I took care of it." The senior flight attendant's entire face changed. She turned to Keanu, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh my God, Mr. Reeves. I am so sorry." Keanu gave her a small, understanding nod, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the air, a voice that sent an instant chill down Madeline's spine. "Excuse me, but what exactly did you do to my guest?" "The woman who owned the skies." Everyone turned toward the sound. Walking toward them was a tall, elegant woman in her early 40s, dressed in a stunning yet understated black suit. Her confidence radiated through the terminal like an unspoken force. She wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't just another VIP. She was Isabel Laurent, the owner of the airline. The moment Madeline saw her, her face lost all color. The onlookers who had been watching in curiosity now gawked in realization. The CEO herself was here, and from the look on her face, she was not happy. The moment everything changed. Isabel's piercing gaze landed on Keanu. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice carrying both apology and authority. "Are you okay?" Keanu, ever composed, gave a small smile. "I think my boarding pass had an unfortunate accident." Isabel's eyes flicked to the torn pieces of paper in Madeline's hands, then back to the trembling airline staff member. Madeline opened her mouth to explain, but nothing came out. Isabel folded her arms. "I'd like to understand why my personal guest was just denied boarding." The entire airport went silent. Madeline's eyes went wide. "Personal guest." Isabel exhaled sharply, clearly holding back her frustration. "Yes, Mr. Reeves was flying on a personally gifted first-class ticket as a thank you for his years of generosity and contributions to humanitarian efforts." She narrowed her eyes. "And you ripped it up." Madeline opened her mouth, but no words came out. Keanu's grace, and a shocking decision. Keanu could see the absolute terror in Madeline's face. He wasn't a vengeful man. He had experienced enough loss, pain, and hardship in life to know that holding on to anger wasn't worth it. So instead of humiliating her further, he extended a hand. "It's all right," he said simply. "People make mistakes." Isabel, still fuming, looked at him for a moment before nodding. "You're too kind, Mr. Reeves." Then she turned to Madeline. "But unfortunately, we can't tolerate this kind of behavior in our company." Madeline's entire body tensed. Isabel gestured to the senior flight attendant. "Please escort her off duty. We'll discuss her employment status later." As Madeline was led away, Keanu turned to Isabel with a small smile. "Well, that was unexpected." Isabel let out a sigh before chuckling. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reeves." And with that, she handed him a new first-class ticket. But this time, it had no expiration date. The flight that took an unexpected turn. The tension that had gripped the terminal finally began to dissolve as Keanu Reeves stepped forward to accept the new first-class ticket from Isabel Laurent, the CEO of the airline. The crowd, still lingering from the spectacle, whispered in awe as the reality of the situation settled in. Madeline, the staff member who had ripped up his original ticket, had already been escorted away. A mix of shock and embarrassment lingered in the air, but Keanu, ever the embodiment of grace, chose not to gloat. He simply nodded in appreciation and followed Isabel toward the jet bridge. "Thank you," he said, offering her one of his signature soft smiles. Isabel returned it, though there was an unmistakable fire in her eyes. "No, Mr. Reeves. Thank you for handling that situation with more patience than most would have." They walked in silence for a moment before Isabel added, "And please, call me Isabel." Keanu nodded. "Only if you call me Keanu." She chuckled. "Deal." As they boarded the aircraft, the flight attendants greeted them with a level of professionalism mixed with awe. It wasn't every day that the owner of the airline and one of Hollywood's most beloved actors boarded together. But what no one knew was that this flight was about to take an even stranger turn. First-class surprises. Keanu took his window seat, stretching out comfortably for the first time that day. The seat was spacious, luxurious, and fitted with every comfort imaginable. But despite the indulgence, Keanu couldn't shake the events that had just unfolded. The way Madeline had assumed he didn't belong. The way she had torn up his ticket without a second thought. And most of all, the way Isabel had stepped in with absolute authority, flipping the power dynamic in an instant. As if reading his mind, Isabel settled into the seat beside him. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Keanu turned to her, slightly amused. "That obvious?" She smiled. "It was unfair, but it happens more than you think." Keanu studied her. "I take it you've dealt with situations like that before." Isabel sighed, folding her hands on her lap. "More than I'd like to admit. Some people in positions of power, no matter how small, let it get to their heads. They think they can decide who deserves what, who belongs where." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you run the whole airline. And you still treat everyone like they matter." She shrugged. "Because they do." Keanu couldn't help but admire her clarity. Isabel was the kind of leader who didn't just own a business. She understood it, respected it, and made sure her people did too. As the plane taxied to the runway, Isabel's voice softened. "Besides, I knew who you were the moment you walked in. But that wasn't why I stepped in." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Oh." She smirked. "I stepped in because I don't tolerate arrogance. And because, quite frankly, I love proving people wrong." Keanu chuckled. "That I can respect." The flight takes a turn. The flight took off smoothly, the city lights of Los Angeles disappearing beneath them. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and for the first time all day, Keanu let himself relax. The flight attendants moved swiftly, offering gourmet meals, warm towels, and a selection of fine wines. Isabel, despite being the airline's CEO, was just another passenger tonight, casually chatting with Keanu as if they had known each other for years. "Tell me, Keanu," she said as they sipped their drinks. "Do you always fly commercial?" He nodded. "As often as I can. I like meeting people. You hear some of the best stories in the most unexpected places." She smiled. "That doesn't surprise me. You seem like the kind of man who values the little things." Keanu tilted his head. "And you? I imagine you don't have time for commercial flights often." Isabel exhaled dramatically. "Barely. But sometimes I sneak in a flight just to remind myself what it's like. You can't run an airline from a boardroom." Keanu nodded in approval. She understood something most corporate leaders didn't. Real leadership meant staying connected. But just as their conversation found a comfortable rhythm, a sudden noise from the cabin interrupted them. A commotion was unfolding in business class. Keanu and Isabel both turned, their easy conversation instantly replaced by curiosity. A familiar face in distress. A flight attendant hurried past, her expression tense. From the corner of his eye, Keanu noticed passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "What's going on?" Isabel asked, already unbuckling her seatbelt. Before the flight attendant could respond, a voice cut through the cabin. "I demand an explanation. I paid for this flight, and I will not be treated like this." Keanu immediately recognized the voice. "Madeline." Isabel's eyes narrowed. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Curious, Keanu stood alongside her as they moved toward the source of the conflict. And there she was, Madeline, the same staff member who had ripped up Keanu's ticket, now arguing with another flight attendant. Keanu and Isabel exchanged glances. "I thought she got escorted out," Keanu muttered. Isabel's jaw tightened. "So did I." The truth comes out. The flight attendant trying to calm Madeline looked exasperated. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but you were rebooked into business class." Madeline scoffed. "Rebooked? I was supposed to be on the ground handling first-class boarding." Why am I suddenly being treated like a passenger? Keanu's eyes widened in realization. Madeleine hadn't just been removed from her post. She had been put on the flight as a passenger. Isabel crossed her arms, her voice icy cold. Because I put you here. Madeleine spun around, her face draining of color. Ms. Laurent. Isabel raised a hand. Save it. You wanted to be in first class so badly that you disrespected one of my guests. Now you get to experience what it's like to be a passenger, one who doesn't get to make the rules. Madeleine opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time, she had nothing to say. The irony of the situation was almost poetic. She had ripped up Keanu's ticket, thinking he didn't deserve first class, only to be placed on the same flight, unable to control her own fate. Keanu, still processing the surreal nature of it all, finally broke the silence. Well, he said, voice light with amusement, this is unexpected. Isabel smirked. You have no idea. A lesson in humility. For the rest of the flight, Madeleine sat quietly in business class, avoiding eye contact. The arrogance she once carried had vanished. And as Keanu settled back into his seat in first class, Isabel gave him a knowing glance. Do you believe in karma, Keanu? He chuckled, swirling his wine glass. After today, I just might. The flight that became a lesson in life. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the first-class cabin, a comforting rhythm against the tension that had just unfolded. Keanu Reeves, sitting comfortably in his spacious seat, glanced across the aisle at Isabel Laurent, the CEO of the airline, who had just delivered a masterclass in poetic justice. Not far from them, Madeleine, the airline employee who had torn up his first-class ticket, sat stiffly in business class, visibly shaken. Gone was the haughty demeanor, the air of superiority she had carried at the airport check-in desk. In its place was quiet humiliation, the weight of her actions settling upon her. Keanu wasn't the kind of man to relish in someone else's downfall. If anything, he felt a little sorry for her. He had been in situations where people judged him based on assumptions, not realizing that underneath the fame, the fortune, and the Hollywood persona, he was just a man trying to get from one place to another like everyone else. Isabel, however, was still fuming. She had seen far too many employees abuse their small sliver of power, treating customers with disrespect simply because they thought no one was watching. But today, someone had been watching. And justice had been swift. An unexpected conversation. A few minutes later, as the flight attendants moved through the cabin offering refreshments, Keanu leaned slightly toward Isabel, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You know, he said, taking a sip of his water, I don't think I've ever seen karma work that fast. Isabel exhaled, rubbing her temple. I didn't plan it that way, but I also couldn't let that kind of behavior slide. I built this airline on the foundation of respect, and she completely threw that out the window. Keanu tilted his head. I take it this isn't the first time you've had to deal with something like this. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Oh, Keanu, you have no idea. She took a sip of her drink before continuing. You wouldn't believe the kind of people I've encountered in this industry. Some of them get so caught up in the idea of status that they forget the basics, how to treat people with decency. I've had corporate executives try to bully their way into upgrades, celebrities throw tantrums when they don't get their favorite seat, and even pilots who thought they were untouchable just because they wore the uniform. Keanu listened intently. He had been in Hollywood long enough to recognize that arrogance was universal. It existed in every industry, in every corner of life. Some people believed their title, their money, or their connections made them above the rules. But Isabel, she was different. He could tell by the way she carried herself, not with entitlement, but with purpose. She wasn't just the owner of the airline. She was a leader, the woman behind the power. Keanu leaned back in his seat, studying her for a moment. You know, you don't seem like the type to just sit in an office all day. I get the feeling you like to be out here, on the ground, seeing how things run. Isabel smirked. Very perceptive. I do spend time in the corporate world, but I also make it a point to take at least one flight a month as a regular passenger. It keeps me connected. It reminds me why I started this in the first place. Keanu raised an eyebrow. And why did you? She exhaled, her gaze shifting momentarily to the window as the clouds drifted past. Because I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be dismissed. Keanu waited, sensing there was more to the story. I grew up in a lower-income family, she continued. We didn't fly much, only when absolutely necessary. But every time we did, I noticed something. The way the flight attendants would treat passengers differently based on their appearance. The way my mother, who worked 3 jobs just to afford that ticket, was looked down upon because she didn't dress like she belonged in business class. The way people assumed we were in the wrong place, just because we didn't fit their idea of what a premium traveler looked like. She turned to Keanu, her eyes burning with conviction. That stuck with me. And when I got older, I told myself, if I ever had the power to change things, I would. Keanu felt a deep respect for her in that moment. He had met a lot of powerful people in his life, but very few who truly understood the weight of the power they held. Isabel did, and she was using it to make a difference. A glance at Madeleine. Keanu's eyes flickered toward Madeleine, who was staring at the seat back in front of her, looking more and more uncomfortable by the minute. She wasn't a villain. She was a product of a flawed mindset, one that placed status above kindness, appearances above character. Maybe she had never been taught otherwise. Maybe she had never been put in a position where she had to see the world from the other side. Isabel followed his gaze. You're thinking about talking to her, aren't you? Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. What gave it away? She sighed, shaking her head with amusement. You really don't like seeing people suffer, do you? It's not that, Keanu said, his voice thoughtful. I just think, sometimes people need a moment like this to change. If no one gives them that chance, they never will. Isabel studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, Keanu. Let's see what you can do. A conversation that needed to happen. Keanu stood up, making his way toward business class, where Madeleine sat with her arms crossed, avoiding eye contact with everyone. As he approached, she tensed. He slid into the empty seat beside her and let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. Rough day, huh? Madeleine swallowed hard, still not looking at him. You could say that. Keanu leaned back. You know, I've met a lot of people in my life. Some good, some not so good. And I've learned that people aren't usually bad. They just don't always realize the impact of what they do. Madeleine finally turned to him, her expression conflicted. I thought you'd want me fired. Keanu chuckled softly. That's not really my style. She let out a breath, her shoulders slumping. I was just trying to do my job. Keanu nodded. I get that. But part of the job, any job, is knowing when to listen. When to step back and think, maybe I don't have all the information. Madeleine sighed. I guess I let my assumptions get the better of me. Keanu smiled. Happens to the best of us. She hesitated. Do you think I deserve to be here? He tilted his head. Do you? She opened her mouth, then closed it again, thinking. For the first time, she really seemed to be processing everything that had happened. Keanu stood up, placing a hand on the seat in front of him. Look, I don't hold grudges. And I don't think Isabel does either. The question is, what are you going to do next? Madeleine looked down, exhaling. I don't know, but I think I have a lot to learn. Keanu nodded, offering her a small smile. That's a good start. A flight that ended differently than it began. As Keanu returned to his seat, Isabel was watching him with an amused smirk. You really are something else, Keanu. He chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. She raised her glass in a small toast. To second chances, then. Keanu clinked his glass against hers. To learning from our mistakes. And as the plane continued its journey through the sky, the world felt just a little bit lighter. The power of redemption. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm after the earlier confrontation. The tension that had once filled the air had now softened, replaced with something more reflective, more introspective. Keanu Reeves sat comfortably in his first-class seat, his thoughts still lingering on the conversation he had with Madeleine. There was something about the way she had looked at him, a mix of guilt and realization, that made him believe she had truly understood the gravity of her mistake. People could change, but only if they were given the chance. Across from him, Isabel Laurent, the CEO of the airline, had been watching him with a quiet amusement. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wine glass before finally speaking. "You have a way of making people rethink their entire existence, Keanu." He chuckled. "I wouldn't go that far." She raised an eyebrow. "No. You turned that woman's worst moment into something she could learn from. Most people would have just demanded she be fired." Keanu shrugged. "I don't believe in burning bridges. Sometimes people just need a little guidance." Isabel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's rare." He smirked. "So I've been told." The conversation drifted for a while, touching on everything from travel horror stories to their favorite places in the world. Despite their vastly different lives, Keanu and Isabel had something in common. They both understood the importance of treating people with kindness. But just as the flight seemed to be reaching a calm, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight situation on board. If there are any medically trained passengers, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." Keanu and Isabel immediately exchanged glances. Something was wrong. An emergency in the sky. Keanu wasted no time. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his instincts kicking in. Isabel followed without hesitation. The flight attendants were already moving quickly, their faces tense, as they hurried down the aisle toward business class. Keanu and Isabel followed them, weaving through the curious passengers who craned their necks to see what was happening. And then he saw it. A man, slumped in his seat, his face pale, his breathing shallow. His wife sat beside him, panicked, her hands gripping his arm. "Please," she begged. "Someone help him." Keanu immediately turned to Isabel. "Do we have a doctor on board?" One of the flight attendants shook her head, looking frazzled. "We're checking, but so far, no one has come forward." Isabel looked toward Keanu. "Do you know first aid?" Keanu nodded. "I've had some emergency medical training for film roles, but I'm no doctor." Still, that was better than nothing. A race against time. Keanu dropped to his knees beside the man, his mind immediately running through the basic checks he had been taught. He placed 2 fingers against the man's neck. His pulse was weak. He looked up at the flight attendant. "We need oxygen and a defibrillator, just in case." The flight crew scrambled into action. Isabel knelt beside Keanu, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "We're going to do everything we can," she said gently. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. He has a heart condition." "But we didn't think." She broke off, shaking her head in panic. Keanu focused. "Sir, can you hear me?" He gently shook the man's shoulder. The man's eyes fluttered weakly, but he didn't respond. The flight attendant rushed back with the oxygen mask, and Keanu carefully helped place it over the man's nose and mouth. "Just breathe," he murmured, watching closely for any changes. Seconds felt like hours. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Passengers were whispering, some holding their breaths, others silently praying. Then, a small but steady change. The man's breathing became a little less shallow. His color, though still pale, was no longer ashen. Keanu let out a slow breath. He turned to the flight attendant. "We need to make sure the pilot knows. If this gets worse, we may need an emergency landing." The crew immediately moved into action, alerting the cockpit. The man, now slightly more aware, blinked up at Keanu with tired, glassy eyes. You're Keanu Reeves," he croaked weakly. Keanu smiled slightly. Yeah, but let's focus on you right now, all right? The man let out a weak chuckle, closing his eyes briefly. Never thought I'd almost die with John Wick saving me. Keanu chuckled softly. Let's make sure you don't die at all, okay? The flight attendants adjusted the man's oxygen, and as the minutes passed, he slowly regained some strength. A doctor had been contacted on the ground, and the flight was already preparing for priority landing procedures. As the situation stabilized, Isabel sat back, watching Keanu in awe. A moment of reflection, when the paramedics met the plane at the gate and the man was safely escorted off. The passengers let out a collective sigh of relief. Some clapped quietly in admiration, while others whispered about the surreal nature of the entire flight. Keanu, exhausted but relieved, slumped back into his seat. Isabel shook her head, exhaling. All right, I take back what I said earlier. Keanu looked at her, raising an eyebrow. Oh, she grinned. You don't just make people rethink their lives, you literally save them. Keanu chuckled. Right place, right time. But Isabel knew better. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. Keanu was just the kind of man who showed up, again and again. And that, she realized, was the difference between a celebrity and a legend, a flight no one would forget. As the passengers finally began deboarding, Madeleine lingered near the exit, watching Keanu. There was something different in her expression now, a kind of deep respect. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Keanu. He turned to her, his expression warm but expectant. Madeleine swallowed, then nodded. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for earlier, but for this. For everything. Keanu studied her for a moment before offering her a small smile. You're welcome. And then, just like that, he walked off the plane, leaving behind a flight full of people who would never see the world the same way again. The ripples of kindness. The plane had landed smoothly, and the airport's medical team had taken over, ensuring the man who had suffered the in-flight medical emergency was safe and stable. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had shifted from anxiety to relief and admiration. Passengers whispered among themselves about how Keanu Reeves had once again proven why he was one of the most beloved people in the world. But for Keanu, it wasn't about recognition or heroism. It was just about being there when it mattered. As he walked toward the airport terminal, his steps slow and reflective, he felt a weight he hadn't noticed before. The day had been an emotional whirlwind, from having his ticket torn up to witnessing poetic justice, to being part of a life-saving moment at 40,000 feet. He was used to chaos on film sets, but real-life moments like this, they had a way of sticking with you. A newfound understanding. Isabel Laurent, the airline CEO, walked beside him, her posture elegant as always, but there was a newfound softness in her expression. The way she had handled the situation with Madeleine, the way she had taken control when the emergency happened, she was more than just a business leader. She was a protector of the people who relied on her airline. As they approached the baggage claim, Isabel finally spoke. You're an enigma, Keanu, she said, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and curiosity. Most people in your position would have been furious about what happened earlier. They would have made demands. Instead, you chose to let it go and focus on something bigger. Keanu offered her a small smile. Anger never fixes anything. People are going to make mistakes. The real question is whether they learn from them. Isabel let out a soft chuckle. You're rare. I hope you know that. Keanu shrugged. I think kindness is a lot more common than people think. It just doesn't always make the headlines. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Maybe so, but today, you reminded a lot of people what it looks like. A surprising apology. As they waited for their luggage, Keanu felt a presence approaching from behind. He turned slightly and found himself face to face with Madeleine. She looked different now. The arrogance that had once dominated her expression was gone, replaced with something far more human, Humility. She swallowed hard, hesitating before speaking. Keanu, She let out a shaky breath and straightened her shoulders. I wanted to apologize. For everything. For how I treated you at check-in. For how I let my pride get in the way. Keanu watched her carefully, sensing the genuine remorse in her words. I was so caught up in thinking I knew better, she continued, that I forgot why I took this job in the first place. I forgot that my role isn't about power. It's about helping people. And you reminded me of that today. Keanu didn't say anything at first, letting her words settle in the space between them. Then, with a soft smile, he extended his hand. Apology accepted, he said simply. Madeleine stared at his hand for a moment, almost as if she didn't believe she deserved forgiveness. But then, after a deep breath, she reached out and shook it. I promise I'll do better, she added quietly. Keanu nodded. That's all anyone can do. An invitation to something bigger. As Madeleine stepped away, Isabel gave Keanu a knowing look. You really don't believe in holding grudges, do you? Keanu chuckled. I think life's too short for them. Isabel smirked. That makes two of us. She paused for a moment before adding, I have an idea. Keanu tilted his head, intrigued. I'm listening. I have a charity foundation tied to the airline, she explained. It focuses on giving opportunities to underprivileged youth, scholarships, career mentorships, things like that. We also fund aviation programs for young people who dream of becoming pilots or flight attendants. Keanu listened intently. I think you'd be an amazing ambassador for it, Isabel continued. You already embody everything we try to teach. Kindness, humility, resilience. And more importantly, you have a way of reaching people in a way that words on a corporate flyer never could. Keanu was silent for a moment, considering it. He had always been passionate about giving back, but this was something new, something that aligned perfectly with his belief in the power of small actions creating ripples of change. Finally, he nodded. I'd love to help. Isabel's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. Then consider yourself officially part of the team. One last lesson in perspective. As they stepped out of the airport, Keanu took a deep breath, feeling the crisp night air against his skin. He had arrived at LAX that morning expecting a quiet, uneventful flight. Instead, he had walked through a gauntlet of assumptions, conflict, redemption, and even an emergency that reminded him of how fragile life truly was. And yet, through it all, one thing remained true. Kindness always found its way back. As Isabel called for her car, she turned to Keanu one last time. You know, you never did tell me what you were heading to Tokyo for. Keanu grinned. Work, but hopefully a little adventure too. Isabel smirked. Well, after today, I think you've had enough adventure for a while. Keanu laughed. You'd be surprised. Life has a way of keeping things interesting. As they shook hands and parted ways, Keanu felt lighter than he had in a long time, because today had been a reminder. A reminder that even when the world seemed full of division and arrogance, there was always room for change, for growth, and for unexpected connections. And as he walked toward his waiting car, he couldn't help but wonder, what ripple effect had today's events set in motion? The ripples of a single act of kindness. The airport was still buzzing with the aftershocks of the unexpected events that had unfolded over the past several hours. From the torn ticket incident to the medical emergency, to Madeleine's redemption arc, Keanu Reeves had unwittingly become the center of a day that no one at this airline would ever forget. But for Keanu, this was never about drama or attention. It was about something deeper. A reminder that in every interaction, no matter how small, we have a choice. A choice to be kind or cruel. A choice to judge or understand. A choice to hold grudges or let things go. As Keanu walked toward the car waiting for him outside the airport, he could still feel the weight of the day lingering on his shoulders. But unlike the exhaustion that came from long hours on set, this was different. This was the exhaustion that came from being present, from carrying the emotions of others, from being part of something bigger than himself. And as he settled into the back seat of the car, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The flight that changed more than just one person. The first-class ticket. The power-tripping airline employee. The unexpected arrival of Isabel Laurent, the CEO of the airline. The dramatic comeuppance of Madeleine. The mid-flight medical emergency that forced everyone to forget their egos and just focus on saving a life. And now, as he left the airport behind, he knew that today had been about more than just a flight. It had been about lessons learned, perspectives changed, and people realizing that one act of kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. He glanced down at his phone and saw a text from Isabel. Isabel, you really don't stop surprising me. Let's talk more about the charity partnership soon. Safe travels, Keanu. He smiled, typing back a quick response. Keanu, looking forward to it. And hey, sometimes life puts us in unexpected places for a reason. Isabel, I think today proved that. Keanu put his phone away and stared out the window at the city lights. And that's when the real impact of what had happened today hit him. This wasn't just about a single flight. This was about how one moment of kindness could shift the trajectory of multiple lives. Madeleine's redemption arc continues. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Madeleine was standing in an empty office, nervously wringing her hands. She had expected to be fired, expected to be humiliated. Instead, she had been given a second chance. And not just any second chance, but one that would allow her to grow into someone better. The head of HR, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, gave her a long, evaluating look. Madeleine, I won't lie to you. What you did today could have cost you your job. But Ms. Laurent believes in redemption. And frankly, after what I saw from you on that flight, I think you're worth the investment. Madeleine swallowed hard. What does that mean? The HR director slid a document across the desk. It means you're being reassigned. Effective immediately, you'll be placed in our customer service training program. You'll learn about empathy, about understanding people, about making sure our airline is known not just for luxury, but for respect. Madeleine blinked. So I'm not fired? No, the HR director said. But make no mistake, this is your last chance. I suggest you make the most of it. Madeleine exhaled in relief. She had spent years climbing the ranks of the airline, believing that power and authority were the only things that mattered. But today had humbled her. And now she had a chance to be better. A new mission takes flight. Several weeks later, Keanu was sitting in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at the headquarters of Isabel's airline. A small group of executives sat at the table, all listening intently as Isabel presented a new initiative. The Aviation Kindness Initiative, she explained, gesturing toward the presentation screen. A partnership between our airline and charitable organizations focused on making air travel more inclusive and welcoming to everyone, regardless of status or background. Keanu listened intently as Isabel continued. Too often, people are judged by their appearance, their class, their financial standing. What happened with Keanu was just one example of the biases that exist in our industry. We want to change that. She turned to Keanu. And that's why we're asking you to be our first official global ambassador of kindness. Keanu raised an eyebrow. That's a pretty fancy title. Isabel smirked. You earned it. The executives nodded in agreement. One of them, a middle-aged man with glasses, chimed in. Mr. Reeves, your actions on that flight reminded us why we got into this industry in the first place. Travel isn't just about getting from one place to another. It's about connecting people. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. He liked that. Travel wasn't just about the destination. It was about the journey, the people, the stories along the way. And if he could play a role in making that journey kinder, more inclusive, and more meaningful for people, then it was a mission worth taking on. He extended his hand toward Isabel. All right, I'm in. She shook it, smiling. "Welcome to the team." The legacy of one flight. A month later, as Keanu walked through an airport for another flight, he noticed something different. The staff interactions had changed. There was a noticeable warmth, a greater emphasis on hospitality and human connection. And at one of the check-in counters, a familiar face stood. Madeline. She was smiling, speaking with genuine kindness to a traveler who seemed confused. She didn't rush him. She didn't dismiss him. She listened. And as she glanced up and met Keanu's eyes from across the terminal, she gave him a small, grateful nod. Keanu nodded back. And just like that, he knew. The ripple effect had begun. Final thought. The true measure of influence. Keanu Reeves never sought power, never sought attention. But today, he had influenced people, not with money, not with fame, but with simple acts of kindness and understanding. And that was more valuable than any first-class ticket.